Hey guys, welcome to our first video on biodiversity this semester. I know that we had some videos related to biodiversity last semester where we talked specifically about the interactions between different species and the niches that different species fill. But we're going to talk specifically in this video about what can we do to sustain our biodiversity, so that we know that we have lots of species that have lots of different roles, and what can we do to keep that biodiversity that we have from falling aside, from us not being able to sustain that same amount of biodiversity. So what I want to start with here are just some terminology. Obviously, hit pause at some point here, copy this down or screenshot it or whatever you do. And we're going to talk a little bit about just each one of these different definitions here. So the first one is when we talk about species going away, we're talking about biological extinction. So if we'll see in a little bit when we talk about categories that you can have extinct in the wild and you can have extinct overall. Generally speaking, though, when we say that something is extinct, we mean that it's gone altogether. There's none of it left on the earth anywhere. Some of this is natural. There's a natural, very low rate of species extinction, and we call that background extinctions. That would naturally go on regardless of what mankind does, regardless of what humans do. Some species are going to become extinct no matter what. Habitats change, the climate changes, even despite our, what we do. They get over, a certain predator maybe gets overpopulated and kills them off. There's some sorts of extinctions that happen regardless. And so that's going to lead us to what we call an extinction rate, which is a percentage, or it could just be a number of species that go extinct within a certain time period. The Earth has undergone several mass extinctions already, and of course these all happened way before humans were on the scene, and so we're definitely not responsible for those. And I think some would probably make the case that, hey, see, this is a natural occurrence anyway, that some of these guys are becoming extinct. So we'll talk a little bit about the moral and ethical issues in class a little bit. There have probably been, depending on how you term mass extinction, though, probably around 3 to 5 of those in our geologic history. What's a little concerning now, though, is that those extinction rates are rising pretty rapidly. Currently, we're at about 1,000 times the normal background rate. The normal background rate is something like 1/10,000%, I believe. And we're at about 1,000 times that, and it's actually picking up really rapidly, sort of in an exponential curve rather than a geometric progression. As we've talked about in class. And if we get to about 1%, which right now, if we're at 1,000 times the background rate, we're probably about 0.1%. But if we get to around 1%, then somewhere around a quarter to a half of the current species would be gone in a century if that rate continued. And of course, there are lots of reasons for that, and we'll get into some more of those in the next video, but just real briefly, a lot of that is due to human activities. We're using a lot more land. We're reducing habitats a lot, and then a lot of their habitats are getting polluted. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. There are some reasons to believe that it could be getting worse than 1%. Okay, so probably somewhere between 0.1 and 1% right now, but there are lots of ecologists out there that think that this rate is actually a lot worse than that. And there are a few reasons. First off, as human population grows, okay, we just talked about human population. So as that is exponentially increasing, then the rate at which we're consuming resources and that we're building out and using land and destroying habitats and probably polluting is going to increase. And so therefore that is likely to, in the future, increase the rate of extinction higher than that 1%. The other two reasons are because certain areas are more biodiverse than others. So when we did our biome projects earlier in the year, and you guys were, say, doing the desert, there were definitely a lot of species out there, but the biodiversity there is nothing compared to, say, a tropical rainforest or a coral reef or something like that, where there's a massive amount of different types of species and different species even of the same types of animals and plants. There are literally millions upon millions of them in those areas. And so in those hot spots, the species are dying out faster there. Now, there are reasons for that. In the coral reefs, the reasons for that can be pollution and the change in climate, all of which causes the coral reef population to die off. In a place like, say, the Amazon, where the rainforests are being harvested for a couple of reasons. They're being harvested for wood, for one thing, and for the species within them. But they're also just being sort of taken down to create more farmland and more cattle land and stuff like that. So as these biological hotspots get degraded and fragmented, more and more species die out than they would in certain other areas. So if you take, say, an area like maybe a savanna or something, which is, I mean, still biologically important, but doesn't have the same, quite the same amount of biodiversity as, say, the coral reef. If the coral reef is going to be more sensitive, then those species are more likely to die out, and that therefore is going to increase the overall extinction rate at a much more rapid pace than even what we're doing right now. Now, when we talk about extinction and we're worried about animals becoming extinct, there are a couple of different categories here. We're going to see that the lines aren't always clearly delineated. But the first one, obviously, and the one that we know about, and we'll talk about the laws in the United States for this in a couple of videos. But the first category that we'll talk about are endangered species. When we say that something is endangered, it basically means that we're down to probably, a few dozen or maybe 100 or 200 individuals of that species. And when you get down to that low point, not only do you have the worry that there's not many of them left, and if anything happens, you might not have any more to reproduce. But what also happens is that the gene pool starts to get really restricted, and also makes them a less viable organism. And so it's very likely that endangered species are at some point going to become extinct. And again, remember that we could have extinct out in the wild, or we could have extinct, but there's still a few individuals in zoos. Those are endangered species. And so something like a Bengal tiger or the California condor, only a few of these left. I think at one point the California condor, they were down to like maybe 76 or so of them that they knew were still around. And again, remember reasons why. Habitats are being massively decreased. There's pollution and things like that especially affects birds that we'll talk about later. So these are endangered species. What we also have are threatened species. Now, threatened species, a lot more individuals than an endangered species. So if we're talking about a threatened species, the numbers are declining. Okay, in other words, they're not growing their population. The numbers are going down, and they're already relatively low to begin with. But when we say low there, we're probably talking like in the thousands of individuals as opposed to in the hundreds or dozens. But since the numbers are declining, if nothing changes, those threatened species eventually then become endangered species. Now, it doesn't always work out that way. A lot of times, and there are some great environmental success stories that we'll talk about in class, of threatened species that we changed something about the way we did, that we passed some laws, and therefore those threatened species basically sort of swelled back in population so that maybe they're not really threatened anymore, and sometimes they're actually taken off of those lists. I said this earlier, and this is a great example of this, I think, that if you, all of the environmental websites and stuff that we'll look at, all kinds of them out there. In this particular one, this is a great example of the fact that there are lots of different categories and lots of different ways that we can define endangered and threatened and all of those things. So, and if you look at this particular website, what they've got right here is they've got the animals of the least concern. So those are ones probably that there are thousands upon thousands of them, maybe millions of individuals of the species. Near threatened, vulnerable, which I would probably categorize as threatened, because if you're near threatened, your next step should probably be threatened. But meaning that they're vulnerable, they're becoming close to getting endangered, and then endangered, obviously, the next category. And then critically endangered, now that would generally be that, you're down to the last, 50 or so, or last couple of dozens of those organisms. Extinct in the wild, because again, there are lots of organisms that as they're starting to go extinct, we're trying to take them into aquariums or zoos or arboretums or whatever and trying to save them, or maybe even just taking genome samples of them so that at some future date that we might be able to reintroduce them into the wild. And then, of course, there's just extinct overall, as in there are no more of them around. There's no real way to be able to save their genome either. Now, there are lots of things actually that endanger species, that cause them to be endangered. Now, we talked about the fact that there are human things that are involved here as well. But there's some characteristics that animals have or plants have that lead them to be more likely to become endangered. First off, if you've got an animal that has a very low reproductive rate, obviously that means that they're going to be unable to, say, recover from something that happens in their environment. So if you got something like maybe, say dogs, where they have a litter of babies every time that they reproduce, then they have a high reproductive rate and they're much more able to recover from something. If you have something like, say, a panda that has one child maybe every so many years or dozens of years, really low reproductive rate, obviously then their numbers are not going to increase very rapidly. Speaking of the panda, something like a specialized niche, of course, is another classic, and we talked about this when we talked about interactions. If you only eat a couple of different kinds of food types and something happens to those food types, then you're obviously going to be in a lot of trouble. Narrow distribution, what this means is that they're only in a certain area. This is where we're sort of getting to with the Asian tigers, that they had certain areas that they were in, and obviously as humans move in and decrease those habitats, their habitats become much smaller, and of course since they're apex predators, they need a lot more room to feed, and of course that goes into the next part here about feeding at a high trophic level. Things that feed at a high trophic level need a massive amount of influx of food in order to be able to sustain themselves, and so they need a wider area, and therefore as we move in, as humans move in and cut their habitats down, not just cut them down figuratively, but decrease the space that they're in, they find it much harder to find their food, and that happens with a lot of apex predators nowadays. If they have fixed migratory patterns, they only migrate to a certain place at a certain time. Something changes at that certain place, then obviously that's going to cause some problems. If they're rare in the first place, which I mean, they're just some species that there aren't a lot of individuals ever really out there, and so obviously that's going to make them more likely to become endangered at some point. If they're commercially viable, and we'll talk about this in the next video, but a lot of these animals get hunted because they have something commercially about them that makes them really valuable, particularly to poachers, and so that's going to lead to them being hunted. And then again, this goes with feeds at high trophic levels, but if they have large territories that they need to hunt in, then obviously that's going to cause them to have a greater likelihood of being endangered. So, the question that should come up with any of this stuff is, I mean, why should we care? I know that this is, particularly, I think a lot of times some of you immediately, have an answer for that, but a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, well, I get that, and I'm taking notes on all this because this is what I do in class, but why should I really care? Well, there's a couple of really good reasons, first off, and I'll give some pragmatic ones. As we said earlier, these are instrumental types of reasons. First off, I mean, all species are a part to some degree or another of Earth's life support system. And so they're going to play a role in the food webs, in that flow of energy at different trophic levels. And then they're part of that chemical cycling process. When we talked about the carbon cycle and stuff like that, if species of plants start to die out and the biomass goes down, then that cycling of, say, carbon and carbon dioxide and oxygen in the atmosphere, it's not going to happen in the same way as species start to die off. Now, if you're cynical, of course, what you can think is, well, they'll just be replaced by some other species or some other type of biomass that could replace them. So a few more then, pragmatic, instrumental reasons why we should care about them. There are places like Belize and Costa Rica that have a lot of ecotourism that brings in a lot of money to their country. Of course, for food crops, I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. That comes in when we think about things like, say, honeybees that are experiencing rapid die-off. We need those honeybees. They need to pollinate things so that we have food crops. Other practical things like fuel wood, lumber, paper, medicines. Almost every pharmaceutical out there has its origin in some sort of natural product, meaning that it was from a plant or animal source originally. And so to be able to maybe discover new medicines for new things, we need to have all of those species out there. And as the species die off, we might be losing, say, maybe the next great medication that's going to be able to cure something. The next reason is that it would take millions of years to rebuild the biodiversity. I mean, we said that we've had these mass, die-offs before, and, you're like, well, we have lots of animals now, so couldn't we just recover from that? And it is possible, but we're talking about geologic time frames. When species die off, especially in large amounts, it doesn't just take, a couple hundred years, everything will be okay. It takes millions of years for the natural processes of evolution to get enough speciation out there to get the biodiversity back to the point that it is. And then, of course, the last one, I think, and this goes back to our intrinsic values that we talked about towards the beginning of the year, there are moral and ethical reasons. I mean, do wild species have a right to exist? Do we say, this species has a right to exist and this doesn't? And these are some of the things that we're going to talk about in class that you guys are going to answer some questions on, because these are important questions, and I can't necessarily tell you, this is the way you should think. I mean, these are moral and ethical questions that you really need to ponder and put some thought into and think about in a really deliberate way, I think, to think about them and what they actually mean and what they would actually mean in practice, because that matters as well. All right, thanks a lot, guys.